causal things that people can knock out? And from your research, I mean, how much of the women's hair comes back?
Well, it's variable. A good percentage of them will. And one of the other components that really is an important element, and really what I believe is the primary cause of obesity in this country, and it's clear and obvious that you walk down any urban area, city, and you'll find that 2 out of 3 people are overweight. I mean, it's really massive epidemic that we're going, and it is relatively recent, and I believe it's related to the manufacture of fructose from done cheaply when the scientists figured how to do that in the mid '70s, and it's just pervaded the food supply. So this fructose as a sugar is just absolutely horrendous.
Now let's talk about high fructose, because now they're running ads where the smart woman, because they know women buy about 80% of the products, it's always a woman telling a man off or telling another woman off that, oh, it's a conspiracy theory that high fructose is bad. Corn syrup is good for you. But then there's all these mainline studies with the diabetes and what it does to our metabolic systems. Dr. Mercola, break down what the high fructose is doing, why it's different from sugar.
Well, sugar, or sucrose, which you can get from canes or beets, it used to be the common way that we got sugar in this country, is really similar. There's not a lot of difference between the two, because simple sugar is 50% fructose and 50% glucose or dextrose. So from that perspective, it's a problem. And if you get high fructose corn syrup, it's about the same ratio. There are 2 differences. One is in high fructose corn syrup, it's a simple sugar and it's dissociated. It's not bonded together with the glucose. So it's absorbed a little more quickly. But the primary reason why it's such a problem is it's so darn cheap. And people, food manufacturers are putting it into everything, so the numbers are going through the roof of what people are consuming. At 1900, Alex, the average person only consumed about 15 grams of fructose, and that was mostly in the forms of fruits, healthy fruits. But now, about 25% of the population is consuming more than 135 grams a day, well more than 10 times what the average person was consuming a mere 100 years ago. So it has significant metabolic problems, and that. So if you have a challenge with your thyroid, or really any health problem, cancer, high blood pressure, diabetes, high cholesterol, one of the most important things you can do is get off the fructose. And the most common, this is really a shock, and I'm sure many of your listeners realize this, but the most common source of calories in the United States, the most common source is fructose, typically in the form of soda. So that's a simple thing to eliminate, and once you get that out of your diet, then your health starts moving in the right direction. So you got to hit the basics. It's really essential.
Wow. Dr. Joseph Mercola is our guest, and we're going to tell you more about his website as we talk to him. I want to go to some calls here soon. It's at Mercola.com. Take control of your health. Just amazing research and information. More and more mainline studies are having to admit in the U.S. and Europe, as you know, that frequency pollution is a big problem, and that the studies are showing with pregnant women, you name it, it's really causing serious issues with the fetuses. From your wide spectrum research, give us your brief take on frequency pollution.
Well, these are definitely a challenge because we're going to explosion. Most people don't realize that cell phones are a relatively recent innovation. Before 25 years ago, they didn't exist anywhere in the world. And, I think it was in the mid-'90s or late '90s, we had 1 billion cell phones, and then we're up to 4 billion now. So this is a relatively recent exposure to this radiation. And just like smoking, I think that's really the most powerful and simple analogy. These exposures don't cause a problem acutely. In other words, it takes time to have this exposure before you're going to notice the difference. You don't get lung cancer after smoking 1 pack of cigarettes. It takes many years, if not decades, to have that exposure before you have a problem and a complication. So similarly, exposure to these cell phones is going to take 5, 10, 20, 30 years before you're going to see an increase in the consequences and the health problems. And the primary ones are going to be brain cancers. And we've already seen this today, but it's going to be exploding. It's going to be just like lung cancer exploded. We're going to see an explosion in brain cancers because of the use of these cell phone devices.
Well, it's being reported, again, like AP, Reuters, you name it, that they're already seeing that. And then you'll see the cell phone makers come out and say, well, we don't completely agree with that, and it's not conclusive. It sounds just like the cigarette makers, even a decade ago, saying, we didn't know this caused cancer. We're not even saying it does cause cancer. And you go back 50 years ago, they said, they had doctors on TV in lab coats going, having a sore throat, smoke an extra merit.
Sure. And the telecommunications industry is a far bigger and more powerful industry than the tobacco industry. There's no comparison. I think it may be one order of magnitude larger. So they have a lot more income and power to play with and manipulate the perception.
What are some of the, there's so many things to talk about. What are some of the other things that are on your radar?
Well, I really believe that the reliance on drugs as a solution for health is a problem. One of the primary issues that we face, and the most significant concern, is that it's becoming progressively more expensive for the drug companies to actually have these drugs approved, and then even once they're approved, then they have to defend lawsuits, typically resulting in billions, if not tens of billions of dollars for the consequence of people taking them. So there's this gradual, because of those two elements, there's this gradual shift towards a model where they're not using drugs anymore. They're going to be using vaccines, which, because of legislation passed 25 years ago, they are exempted from any prosecution, and they're a lot easier to pass. So they're going to manipulate the whole system so that they're actually not voluntary, so that they become mandatory. So there's tens of billions of dollars of profit. There's this gradual shift. There's probably hundreds or more vaccines that are in the pipeline right now for targeting for our population, and that's definitely a concern.
I just learned something new. I know about all the new classes of vaccines that cure depression, and that's in quotes, or smoking, or cocaine, or anger, or vaccines that make you calm and not have anxiety anymore. And I go read the different patents. Most of them are literally genetically engineered viruses, or the equivalent of nanotech, that go in and destroy the neurons so that you can't even receive those different chemicals in your brain. This is the equivalent of a viral lobotomy. They have other types that create plaques, other types that then attack hormones. And I want you to speak to this, but I had never put two and two together. That's why they admit they're moving almost exclusively to vaccines, because that'll be the new delivery system via manipulation of your body, of pharmakeia, and they've got this body of law with the Vaccine Damage Fund and the national security angle. That is nightmarish. So what specifically can you say about them coming out and saying, look, we got a vaccine that will cure you being upset, but then it blocks your endorphins? This is scary.
Well, it's this immunity from prosecution that's the most concern, because they can really sell these things. And in the case of last year of the swine flu, which I think is, our site's been around for 12 years, but I think our most significant contribution is really being a primary catalyst for educating consumers that the vaccine was nonsense. And as a result of that, 70% of the U.S. public chose not to get the vaccine, despite the president coming out.
And you were vindicated, because everything you and many others talked about came out to be absolutely right and more.
Sure, the right is. It's so easy to predict these things, Alice. Especially with the flus, because all we have to do is look at Australia, which is literally 6 months ahead of us. And you look at their experience, and we're going to exactly replicate it. There's no mystery. This is not rocket science.
That's right. They had deaths. They had massive brain damage, all neurological.
And they didn't have the epidemics that they were projecting. So, you can predict these things 6 months in advance with virtually 100% accuracy. But they don't want you to understand that. So it's pretty simple stuff once you understand the basics.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Almost all flus start in the other hemisphere or in Asia, and so we really should always know what type of flu is coming around the bend, and any type of.
And the flu or any infectious disease, for the most part, is not something to be distressed about, because if you're following healthy lifestyles, and if you go to my site, just on the homepage, we've got a whole 40-page report on how you can, there's no charge for how you can optimize your lifestyles based on beginner, intermediate, advanced models. And one of the most important things you can do is optimize your vitamin D levels. We touched on it earlier, but if your vitamin D levels are normal or optimal, over 50 nanograms per milliliter, you're going to be resistant to the vast majority of infectious disease. And if you're cutting out the sugar and you're exercising, you're sleeping well, drinking clean water, staying away from toxins, it's virtually impossible to get sick. Just no don't get sick. So you don't forget about the vaccines. You don't have to worry about even any downtime, any coughs, colds, or flus when winter comes. And I can't tell you, it's just almost universal, the responses that we get from people who adopt these strategies and change their lifestyle, and they can experience this, relief from these infectious diseases.
But then going back to what happened last year, as you know, but I'd like you to speak to this, Dr. Mercola, they did Canadian studies and others that showed if you took the H1N1 vaccine, it lowered your immunity by 50% to the regular seasonal.
Yeah.
Quantify that from what Dr. Blaylock and others have said here, medical doctors, that basically your body gets overwhelmed, then it doesn't know how to respond to a real threat.
You're absolutely correct. If you get the swine flu, the studies have conclusively proven that it actually increases your risk for getting the regular seasonal flu. So what do you think they did in the United States, and I think in most other countries of the world, with the flu vaccine this year? They combined them both, and you don't have a choice. If you get one, you get the other. So it's beyond crazy what they're doing, but it makes perfect sense if you're one of the executives in the drug industry, because you're going to be reaping profits.
And obviously, they want a captive audience. They go lobby billions of dollars to your state and federal legislature, and more we're seeing the government attempt to try to force vaccines on people, and they're coming out with hundreds of new vaccines. As you pointed out, medicine is shifting over almost entirely to vaccines because of the liability protection. This is a nightmare, but at the same time, record low numbers of people took the flu shot. It's starting to the same thing this year. How do you see the system striking back? I mean, they want to make their hundreds of billions, and because of Mercola and Infowars.com and all the other great people out there, folks are waking up. What do you see the establishment doing?
I don't know. I don't really get into those projections too much, but they're going to come out. They're going to want to try. I think the immediate threat is they're going to make it mandatory, and we're partnering with one of the top pro-vaccine safety sites in the world, which is the National Vaccine Information Center, NVIC.org. And we're really developing a massive consumer awareness component where we're lobbying for people to get together in their own local communities and hit their state legislators. So we will prevent this from happening. But I think that's the next big battle, is to make sure right now that we don't shift to a mandatory vaccine system, because right now we have the freedom to choose not to get them, even though there are essentially the freedom is somewhat nullified if you have a child who's going to school, because they're going to prevent entry into most school systems unless you're vaccinated. But you can always homeschool, or you can go to a state that doesn't require it and has a philosophical exemption. So it's not as bad as it could be. That's for sure. If these mandatory vaccine laws get passed.
We're going to break here in a moment. We're going to come back and take a few calls for Dr. Joseph Mercola. But briefly, what are you seeing on the front of GMO crops, cross-species chimeras, like the GMO salmon, the move to not even let us know if it's GMO in the stores?
Well, it's a big issue. I think we're going to be very successful in that. We're partnering with Jeffrey Smith, who was just on Dr. Oz yesterday, and got a very favorable response. But it's just providing people, the consumers can make the choice here. If they can vote with their pocketbooks, once they understand the issue, they can actually choose not to purchase this. And just like they did in Europe, once their profits go down, the people who are the industries who are manufacturing this, they will choose not to. So we can easily defeat that without any legislation, without any governmental intervention. It's a really simple process.
Amazing. Dr. Mercola is our guest. Briefly, as we go to break, what are some of the other things that you're looking at right now?
Well, it's one of the most exciting ones. Fluoride is a big issue, and then also